If you want to know how a simple doctor's visit turned into a major scandal that made an entire town reevaluate its values, make sure to read this story until the end. This is a tale of injustice, resilience, and how the truth always finds a way to prevail. Walter Jenkins was a war veteran. His gray hair, tired eyes, and the cane he leaned on were marks of a long life filled with hardship and perseverance. His 12-year-old granddaughter, Emma, accompanied him to the hospital, hoping he would finally receive the help he desperately needed. In recent weeks, the pain in his back had become unbearable. Walter, being a man who had endured much, tried to hide his suffering, but Emma knew better. She knew they needed to act. The hospital they went to was known for its highly skilled doctors. But instead of compassion and professionalism, they were met with indifference and coldness. Dr. Gray, an elderly man with an apathetic demeanor, didn't even bother to look at them. Walter handed over his insurance papers, but the doctor's response was like a slap in the face: "Go somewhere else." Emma was confused. She couldn't understand why they were being turned away. "We didn't do anything wrong," she thought. But Walter knew the truth. He was a veteran, a man who had served and protected his country, but his skin color still seemed to be a barrier, even decades after the war. They left without receiving any help. Emma felt a mix of anger and helplessness. She watched her grandfather endure the pain, but what enraged her even more was the humiliation he had faced. Walter, however, remained calm. He had witnessed the worst in humanity and knew that the truth always finds a way. A few days later, journalists learned about the incident. Reports describing the event quickly spread across social media. People were outraged. How could someone treat a veteran like this, they asked. Walter's story sparked a public outcry. Protests began outside the hospital. Crowds demanded Dr. Gray be fired for denying care to a man whose health had suffered while serving the nation. Each day, the protests grew louder, and the hospital's reputation worsened. Within weeks, Gray was dismissed. He never commented on his actions, but for the public, that no longer mattered. Walter, the man they tried to make feel unworthy, became a symbol of resilience and dignity. And Emma, watching her grandfather maintain his pride even in the face of humiliation, realized that true strength lies in self-respect. This story reminds us that we cannot remain indifferent to injustice. And if you ever find yourself in Walter's shoes, know that you deserve respect and support, no matter who you are or where you come from. The story of Walter Jenkins and his unjust treatment didn't fade into silence. Instead, it sparked a wave of outrage that swept through the town like wildfire. Social media exploded with posts condemning the incident, with hashtags like #JusticeForWalter and #RespectOurVeterans trending locally. People who had once felt powerless against prejudice now had a rallying point, and Walter's name became a symbol of resilience and dignity. For Walter, however, life continued as usual. He still struggled with his pain, still leaned on Emma for support, and still carried the weight of his quiet dignity. He didn't ask for the attention, but he knew his story was no longer just his own, it was a spark for something greater. The protests outside the hospital grew larger by the day. What began as a small group of veterans holding signs soon turned into a full-blown movement. Families, students, and activists joined in, chanting for accountability. News crews arrived, cameras capturing the faces of anger and determination. Yet, amidst the chants and the media frenzy, Walter sat in his modest home, distant from the noise. His granddaughter Emma scrolled through the countless messages online, some offering support, others questioning how such an injustice could still occur. She looked at her grandfather, who seemed lost in thought. "Grandpa, they're listening," she said quietly, her voice trembling. Walter's gaze didn't waver, but his voice was steady. "They're not listening to me," he said. "They're listening to what they want to believe." As the movement grew, the town itself began to fracture. Some defended Dr. Gray, claiming he was overwhelmed or simply misunderstood. Others outright denied that racism played a role, arguing that Walter's case was being blown out of proportion. But for every voice of doubt, there were 10 others demanding change. The hospital administration, under mounting pressure, released a statement. It was as hollow as the cold corridors Walter had walked through. "We regret any inconvenience caused and are committed to providing care for all patients." The words only added fuel to the fire. Emma couldn't contain her frustration. "How can they call this inconvenience?" she asked aloud, her eyes filling with tears. Walter simply placed a hand on hers, a gesture of comfort even as his own pain persisted. For him, this wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring no one else endured the same humiliation. But the town's division made it clear, this wasn't just about Walter anymore. It was about the deep-seated cracks in the community, cracks that his story had brought into sharp focus. One night, as the protests reached their peak, a group of Walter's fellow veterans took the stage outside the hospital. They weren't activists or politicians, just men and women who had fought alongside him or in battles of their own. "We've bled for this country," one of them said, his voice trembling with emotion. "And yet, here we are, fighting for basic respect. Walter Jenkins didn't just serve this nation, he represents the best of it. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're the ones who don't belong here." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. But inside his home, Walter sat quietly, staring at the medals he hadn't touched in years. Emma watched him, her heart heavy. "You should be out there," she said softly. Walter shook his head. "They don't need me to stand with them. They need me to stand for what's right." Days later, under immense public pressure, the hospital's board held a press conference. Dr. Gray was absent. Rumors swirled about his resignation, but no official statement confirmed it. The board announced a full review of their policies and promised sweeping changes. Yet, for many, the damage had already been done. Walter's name was etched into the town's memory as a catalyst for change. Schools and community centers invited him to speak, to share his story and remind everyone of the cost of silence in the face of prejudice. He accepted these invitations not out of pride, but because he knew the importance of using his voice for those who couldn't. Months passed, and the protests faded. But the impact of Walter's story lingered. The hospital implemented new training programs, and local organizations began initiatives to address systemic bias. Dr. Gray's name became synonymous with shame, a cautionary tale of what happens when prejudice goes unchecked. For Walter and Emma, life returned to its quiet rhythm. But every time they walked through town, they saw the glances, the nods of respect, and the whispered acknowledgments. Walter never sought to be a hero, but his quiet dignity had made him one. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching Emma play in the yard, a neighbor approached with a hesitant smile. "Mr. Jenkins," the man began, his voice uneasy, "I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything." Walter nodded, his expression as steady as ever. "I didn't do this for thanks," he replied. "I did it so no one else has to." And with those words, he leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of his actions, and his quiet triumph, settle into the cool evening air. This chapter shows how one man's dignity and perseverance can ignite a movement, changing not only the lives of those around him but the values of an entire community. Months after the protests had died down, the town began to settle into a new rhythm. The name Walter Jenkins no longer dominated headlines, but his story lingered in the air, reshaping conversations in quiet but profound ways. For Walter, life returned to its familiar simplicity. Yet, the echoes of the injustice he endured reverberated far beyond the walls of his modest home. It started with a letter. Emma brought it in one morning, placing it on the kitchen table where Walter was sipping his coffee. The envelope was crisp and embossed with a logo Walter didn't recognize. Emma's eyes lit with curiosity as Walter carefully opened it. Inside was an invitation from the mayor's office. "We would be honored," the letter read, "if you would join us as the keynote speaker for our annual Veterans Day ceremony. Your story has inspired many, and we believe your voice is essential as we strive toward a more inclusive future. Walter set the letter down, his expression unreadable. Emma looked at him, her voice tinged with excitement. You have to do it, Grandpa, she said, her hands gripping the edge of the table. People need to hear from you. But Walter didn't respond immediately. He stared out the window, his thoughts distant. He had never sought to be a symbol, never intended for his quiet strength to become a public rallying cry. Yet, he couldn't deny the impact his story had made. After a moment, he nodded. I'll think about it, he said simply. As Veterans Day approached, the town buzzed with anticipation. The mayor's office announced Walter's participation publicly, and the ceremony quickly became the most anticipated event in years. For Walter, preparing for the speech was a daunting task. Words didn't come easily to him. He'd always been a man of action, letting his deeds speak louder than anything he could say. Emma, however, was determined to help him find the right ones. Talk about what it means to serve, she suggested one evening. Not just in the military, but in life. You've taught me so much about standing tall, even when it's hard. Walter smiled at her, a rare softness in his usually stoic demeanor. Maybe I'll do just that, he said. Meanwhile, the town was undergoing its own transformation. The hospital's new policies were beginning to take effect. A diversity committee had been established, and training sessions on bias and empathy were now mandatory for all staff. Though Dr. Gray had resigned quietly, his absence was a reminder of how deeply prejudice could embed itself in even the most respected institutions. Veterans Day dawned clear and cold, with sunlight cutting through the crisp November air. The town square was packed with people, from schoolchildren waving small flags to elderly veterans wearing medals on their chests. At the center of it all stood a stage, modest but dignified, where Walter would soon address the crowd. Emma sat in the front row, her heart pounding with pride. She watched as her grandfather, dressed in a simple suit, stepped up to the podium. The murmurs in the crowd ceased, replaced by an expectant silence. Walter began slowly, his deep voice carrying across the square. When I was a young man, he said, I thought serving my country would mean wearing a uniform and carrying a weapon. And for a time, it did. But as I've grown older, I've learned that service doesn't stop when the war ends. It continues in how we treat each other, in how we stand up for what's right. The crowd hung on his every word. Walter spoke about the values he had fought to defend, equality, justice, and respect, and how those values had been tested not on the battlefield, but here at home. There are battles we fight with guns, he said, and battles we fight with our hearts and minds. The latter can be just as hard. But those battles are worth fighting because they shape the world we leave for our children. Emma felt tears prick her eyes as the crowd erupted into applause. Walter stood tall, his presence commanding yet humble. In that moment, he wasn't just a man recounting his story, he was a beacon of hope, a reminder that resilience could overcome even the deepest injustices. Walter's speech sent ripples through the community. The local school district invited him to speak to students about history, integrity, and the importance of standing against prejudice. His story was added to the curriculum as a way to teach children about resilience and the power of speaking out. Meanwhile, Emma found her own voice. Inspired by her grandfather, she started a student-led initiative at her school to promote inclusivity. The initiative gained traction, spreading to other schools in the region. For Emma, this was more than a project, it was her way of ensuring that what happened to her grandfather would never happen to anyone else. Months later, Walter returned to the hospital, not as a patient, but as a guest of honor. The diversity committee invited him to speak to the staff, many of whom had been deeply moved by his story. Walter addressed them with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout his ordeal. We all make mistakes, he said. What matters is how we learn from them. Every day is an opportunity to do better, to treat each other with the respect we all deserve. As he left the hospital, Walter felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The pain in his back still lingered, but the burden of injustice had eased. He hadn't just endured, he had transformed his suffering into something greater, a legacy of hope, change, and unity. Walter Jenkins' story became more than a moment in the town's history. It became a movement, a reminder that one person's dignity could inspire a community to confront its flaws and strive for something better. And though Walter returned to his quiet life, sitting on his porch and watching Emma grow into a force of change, his name remained a symbol. Not just of the man who had endured injustice, but of the power of resilience, and the belief that no matter how deep the scars, healing and progress are always possible. The winter following Walter Jenkins' Veterans Day speech was quiet, yet it carried the weight of transformation. Snow blanketed the town, softening the hard edges of buildings and streets, just as Walter's story had softened the hearts of those who once turned a blind eye to injustice. But change, as Walter had always known, was not a destination, it was a journey. And this time, it was Emma who would take the next steps. Emma's school initiative had grown beyond her wildest dreams. What began as a small group of classmates discussing inclusivity turned into a regional network of students advocating for equality. They called themselves the Unity Project, and Emma, despite her young age, became its unofficial leader. Walter watched her with quiet pride. She reminded him of his younger self, unwavering in her resolve but carrying a fire he wished he had possessed at her age. Though he often stayed in the background, his presence was felt in every word Emma spoke, every action she took. She was carrying forward the legacy he had unintentionally begun. With success came resistance. Not everyone welcomed the Unity Project's message. Parents at a neighboring school district accused the group of stirring up unnecessary drama, claiming their focus on inclusivity was a distraction from academics. Online forums buzzed with criticism, some of it pointed directly at Emma. "She's too young to understand what she's doing," one post read. Another went further, "This is all her grandfather's doing. He's using her to keep himself in the spotlight." Emma saw the comments, her heart sinking with each word. For the first time since the movement began, she doubted herself. Was she doing the right thing? Had she overstepped? Walter noticed her hesitation one evening as she stared at her laptop, the glow illuminating her downcast face. Without a word, he pulled a chair beside her and gently placed his hand on hers. "People only push back when they're scared of what you're changing," he said simply. Emma looked at him, her eyes brimming with uncertainty. "What if they're right, Grandpa? What if I'm not ready for this?" Walter's expression didn't waver. "Emma, change doesn't wait for you to feel ready. It happens because it has to. You're doing what's right. That's all that matters." Encouraged by her grandfather's words, Emma returned to the Unity Project with renewed determination. Instead of fighting the criticism, she chose to embrace it as an opportunity to educate. The group organized a town hall meeting, inviting parents, teachers, and students to discuss their goals openly. Walter attended, though he stayed in the back, blending into the crowd. He wanted this to be Emma's moment. The meeting began tensely. Some parents voiced their frustrations loudly, accusing the Unity Project of pushing an agenda. Others, however, spoke in favor of the group, sharing stories of how their children felt more included and understood. Then Emma stood up. She was smaller than everyone else on the stage, her voice quieter than the shouting, but as she began to speak, the room fell silent. "This isn't about blame or shame," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she held the microphone. "It's about creating a space where everyone feels they belong. That's not political. It's human." Her words were met with a standing ovation. Even some of the skeptics nodded grudgingly. Walter, watching from the back, felt a lump in his throat. Emma was proving what he had always believed: resilience and kindness could win hearts, even in the face of resistance. Months later, the Unity Project was recognized statewide. Emma received an award for her leadership, and though she accepted it humbly, she dedicated it to her grandfather. "This isn't just my story," she said during the ceremony. "It's my grandfather's. It's everyone's who has ever felt like they didn't belong. Together, we're proving that change is possible." Walter, sitting in the audience, couldn't help but smile. He didn't need awards or recognition. Emma's growth was all the validation he'd ever wanted. That evening, back at their small home, Emma placed the award on the mantel. She sat beside Walter, who was sipping tea by the fireplace. "Grandpa," she said, her voice soft, "do you think we've made a difference?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the fire, its flickering light dancing across the walls. "Emma," he finally said, "every person who feels stronger because of what you've done is a difference. And every one of them will go on to make more. That's how change works. It's slow, and it's quiet, but it's unstoppable." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, letting his words sink in. She didn't need everyone's approval. She didn't need to fix everything overnight. She just needed to keep going. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Emma continued her work, and Walter continued to cheer her on from the sidelines. His story had ignited a spark, but it was Emma who carried the torch forward. Together, they proved that even the smallest voices could echo loudly in a world that often refused to listen. And though Walter's journey had begun with pain and injustice, it ended with hope. Not just for himself, but for Emma, and for everyone who dared to believe that dignity and kindness could overcome even the darkest of days. If you've been following the journey of Walter Jenkins and his granddaughter Emma, you know that their story is one of courage, perseverance, and hope. But every story needs an ending, and this one will leave you with a truth as timeless as the man who inspired it. Read to the end to discover how their fight for justice became more than a movement, it became a legacy. A year after Walter Jenkins' story first captured the town's attention, the community gathered to honor him in a way no one could have imagined. The city council had voted unanimously to rename the town's Central Park after Walter, a place where people of all backgrounds could come together. The announcement had brought a swell of emotion throughout the town. For many, it felt like a long overdue acknowledgement of Walter's sacrifices and strength. The day of the dedication was warm and bright. The park was filled with laughter and music as families picnicked under the shade of towering oaks. A stage had been set up near the center of the park, where a new plaque awaited unveiling. Emma stood beside it, holding her grandfather's hand tightly as he looked out at the crowd gathered in his honor. Walter's name, once spoken with quiet respect by those who knew him, now resonated across the community as a symbol of unity and resilience. Yet, as he stood there, he felt no pride, only gratitude. "I didn't fight for recognition," Walter said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, as he addressed the crowd. "I fought for a world where no one would have to go through what I did. A world where respect isn't a privilege, it's a right." The crowd erupted into applause, and Walter stepped back, letting Emma take the microphone. Her voice, steady and confident, carried his message forward: "This park isn't just about honoring my grandfather. It's about the future we're building together. A future where everyone belongs." The plaque was unveiled, its bronze surface gleaming in the sunlight. It read, "Walter Jenkins Memorial Park, a place for unity, dignity, and hope." As the weeks passed, life began to settle again. Walter continued his daily routine, though now it included occasional visits to the park that bore his name. He would sit on a bench under an old oak tree, watching children play and families gather. He didn't see the park as his, it belonged to everyone, just as he had always hoped. Emma, too, had found her rhythm. The Unity Project continued to thrive, with chapters forming in schools far beyond their small town. Though the work was hard and often met with resistance, Emma pressed on, her grandfather's quiet strength guiding her every step. One evening, Walter sat in his favorite chair, gazing at the fire crackling in the hearth. Emma joined him, curling up in the chair beside him with a book. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from deep understanding. "Grandpa," Emma said suddenly, breaking the quiet, do you ever think about how much has changed because of you? Walter smiled faintly, shaking his head. It wasn't just me, Emma. Change is never just one person. It's everyone who stood up, spoke out, and refused to back down. I was just the spark. Emma nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. But you taught me how to be the flame. Walter's health began to decline not long after. The years of hard work and quiet endurance had taken their toll, and the pain he had carried for so long grew heavier. Emma stayed by his side, caring for him as he had once cared for her. One evening, as the sun set and cast golden hues across the walls of their home, Walter took Emma's hand. His voice, though weak, was steady. "Emma," he said, "the work isn't done. It never will be. But you've already shown me that you're strong enough to keep going. Promise me you'll never let anyone dim your light." Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. "I promise." When Walter passed, the entire town mourned. The park was filled with flowers and candles, tributes left by people whose lives he had touched in ways he would never know. Veterans saluted him, children wrote letters thanking him, and families came together to honor his memory. Emma spoke at his memorial, her voice trembling but resolute. "My grandfather taught me that dignity is not something you wait for, it's something you demand. He showed me that kindness and resilience are the most powerful tools we have to change the world." In the years that followed, Emma carried Walter's legacy forward. She became a powerful voice for justice, advocating for systemic change and inspiring others to join her cause. The Unity Project expanded nationwide, its mission rooted in the values Walter had lived by: respect, inclusion, and hope. The park remained a gathering place for the community, its plaque a constant reminder of the man who had turned his pain into progress. Children played under the oak trees, families laughed together, and people of all backgrounds found common ground there. It was a living testament to Walter's belief that unity was not just an ideal, but a necessity. Walter Jenkins' story reminds us that true strength is found not in grand gestures, but in the quiet determination to stand up for what's right. His legacy lives on in the park that bears his name, in the work of his granddaughter, and in every person who finds courage in his example. Change is slow. It is often painful. But as Walter showed, it is unstoppable when fueled by kindness, resilience, and a belief in something greater than ourselves.